Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. I'm your host, David Allan-Petale, and my guest tonight is the author, David Whish-Wilson. Good evening, David. How are you going?
Good. Thanks. Yourself, David?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Now, before we get stuck in, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and also to acknowledge that I'm also broadcasting from Rottnest, Whadjuk, and also that David Whish-Wilson is joining me from Fremantle, Whyalla. So paying respects to the lands that we're both on as a way of paying respect to the oldest culture, oldest continuing culture on our planet. So traditional storytelling, very much a part of that. Now, before we get started with David, we're going to be talking to him about his book, I'm Already Dead, which is available through Fremantle Press and also on the Libby app. If you have questions about anything in this book or any of the other many titles that David's written, please jump into the comments and I'll do my best to weave them in. So without any further ado, let's get started. So David, could you please just introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit about what I'm Already Dead is about?
Sure. Okay, well, I'm a Fremantle, Whyalla-based writer. I primarily write crime fiction, but I've written some historical fiction and some creative non-fiction, but crime fiction is my jam, I suppose. And I'm Already Dead is my sixth crime novel, I think. And it's the second in a series that started with True West, which came out in 2019, I think. However, there's a character in there, Frank Swann, who is my original character through four other novels, and he was getting a bit quite long in the tooth, and I just couldn't find a way to retire him. So I've kept him in the picture. He's now kind of training Lee Southern, who in True West was a 17-year-old, running away from Geraldton down to Perth. Got caught up in West Australia's then late 1980s right-wing nationalist malarkey, and managed to get out of it. I'm Already Dead. It projects forward a few years, so it's the mid-90s. The title comes from a time when I used to live in Japan, and during the day I did a lot of different jobs, worked as a travel agent and bartender, worked in restaurants, occasional bouncer, and I also studied Japanese and martial arts during the day. And I'm Already Dead, apparently, as it was told to me by one of my senseis, was an old samurai saying that samurai warriors would say to themselves before they went into battle, so that they wouldn't be if you convince yourself that you're already dead, you've got nothing to fear, right? So that was the kind of the approach. And because of the trouble that Lee Southern inevitably gets in I Am Already Dead, I thought it was a little bit apt. The idea for the story came from a conversation I had with a Melbourne-based crime writing friend of mine who had newly become a father. And he said that he was a bit surprised amidst all the exhaustion and sleeplessness to discover that he'd begun sleeping with a hammer beside his bed. And he's a very mild-mannered kind of fella, but it was his instincts were somehow telling him that, now he had a family, he had young children in the house, he needed to be this new kind of person. So I always thought that was quite interesting, but because there are so many novels already working with the trope of, how far will a parent go to protect their child, I wanted to kind of reverse it a little bit and have a look at what kind of deviant personality would deliberately put their child in harm's way and what the consequences of that might be. And I can't talk too much about that, obviously, but Lee Southern is there. He's in his mid-20s. He's trying to make a go of it as a kind of a low-rent trainee private investigator or citizen detective. He's got a side hustle restoring vintage cars. He works as a bouncer in a Northbridge nightclub. And when Frank Swann comes to him with a job from one of the local real estate tycoons, basically a pretty straightforward job. It's just breaking and entering private residences and retrieving photographs. He's curious about this particular real estate developer. He's never really met anyone like him. He comes from a different kind of background. So he takes the job, and of course, because it's a crime novel, he soon finds himself in too deep, and the story proceeds from there.
Well, Lee often finds himself in too deep, but I found him to be, he's a fascinating character because he's really good with his hands. You know, he knows what to do in the moment of terrible action, but he's not someone who seeks it out. That's what sort of what drives Lee Southern to be this way? Is he attracted to the darkness here, or does it just tend to find him?
Yeah, good one. I mean, I've always thought of him as a character who, if he had had a different upbringing, he would be a completely different person. For those who haven't read True West, Lee Southern had a pretty unusual upbringing. He was brought up by a paranoid father who was tangentially part of the 1980s right-wing movement here in Western Australia. He believed, one of those crazies who believed that Indonesia was inevitably going to invade Australia and he needed to arm himself. He's a kind of a war-damaged veteran. And so he brought up Lee, who's his only child, from a very young age to be a soldier and to be independent and to be very good with his hands, to be able to fix just about anything, to be able to survive off the land, and also to be able to look after himself in difficult kind of situations. At the same, so he has that kind of grit in him, I suppose. But I've always thought of him as more, he's kind of a gentle, reflective soul. Um, he's confident because he knows whatever the situation, he's probably going to be okay. But yeah, with a different upbringing and in a different context, he might be someone completely different, which I think is pretty true to lots of people I have met who are like Lee Southern. They've become that way because of circumstances rather than some kind of psychopathy or sociopathy or whatever the case.
And I felt in quite safe hands with Lee because there's two sort of aspects to the book that you return to. It's that he's doing the panel beating work on the Dodge, so he's sanding back this car so it's perfect and constantly checking it. So you see the meticulous side of his nature, but then you see him in the boxing gym where he's preparing, and there's a section where you talk about that his confidence comes from being prepared. It doesn't come from a cockiness. It comes from that he's ticked every box and he knows where he's at, and then he'll be ready to face anything. But he's going to need that confidence, isn't he, with what he's about to face?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's exactly it. He is meticulous, and he's given to um, the kind of the slow, painstaking labor of restoring a car. Um, all of the attention to detail that requires, because he doesn't sleep much, so he does it late at night. He enjoys his own kind of company, and while he's doing that kind of work, he gets time to think about things. Um, but yeah, down at the boxing gym where he volunteers as a kind of a teacher, it's where he, I suppose. Hi Maddie, how you going? Uh, it, yeah, it's where he gets to explore another side of himself. Well, one is, he enjoys being a teacher and giving a little bit back to the community, but also, yeah, he's learned the hard way that if you're not prepared for dangerous situations, then yeah, it can be to your definite detriment.
So thank you to Madeline Dickey for jumping into the comments. We'll get to that question a little later. But if anybody else has a question, please jump in as well, and I'll weave them in. But Mads, we will get to you on that. But David, you mentioned a little bit about the central crime that's driving things here. Lee, one night, he's working the door at, is it the Summertime Lounge?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, in Northbridge, and then there's a burglary, and then from there, all manner of complex, uh, layered mystery starts happening. What is the vortex that Lee is suddenly sucked into?
Yeah, in some respects, it's a strange part of the craft, or at least the way I go about it. I often start with different disparate stories, and I don't really know how they're going to join, and that's a bit of a challenge for myself. So I wasn't quite sure why the break-in was going to happen initially, but yeah, so he's working the door at a nightclub, and these two kind of local thugs who have been fired from being doormen at this nightclub, which again is based on a true story I once heard. They decided that they would reapply for their jobs by taking the door, which is a strange kind of concept. Unfortunately for Lee, he's on the door, so he doesn't feel any great kind of loyalty to the club. It's just a job after all. But these two guys, it turns out, they're going to rush the door and try and create a scene of chaos. But meanwhile, there's a robbery going down. Lee doesn't really want anything to do with the aftermath of the robbery. It's just a part-time job. But it turns out that the two things are linked in ways that I probably can't go into. But the job that he's taken on for Enright, who's the local real estate tycoon, who wants photographs recovered, and the burglary that takes place in the Summertime nightclub are linked by way of a couple of main characters. And so in doing his job as a citizen investigator, working for Frank Swann, for Enright, the real estate tycoon, he draws attention to himself, negative attention, I suppose you could call it. And reluctantly, the job he does for the owner of the nightclub in trying to deal with the robbery, the two things slowly start to converge. And I'm glad they did, because for a while there, I didn't know if they were going to. And, that's always a bit anxiety producing.
David, a bit of a philosophical question here, but it's one that I kept thinking while I was reading. It's how much of history, official history at least, or journalism, how much do we actually know about what actually goes on in our towns and in our cities and in our lives versus what actually happens? Because reading I'm Already Dead, I felt like I was constantly being told secrets. I was constantly being told, hang on, this is what you can see here, but underneath here, this is all this other stuff that's going on. So
yeah. Well, I guess that's what drives a lot of journos I know, and also a lot of writers, particularly crime writers, wanting to know what really goes on rather than the kind of the cover story, I suppose. And certainly it's fair to say that living in the city that I do, which is a pretty good place at erasing history and a pretty good place at concealing secrets, the practice of trying to figure out what's going on in a way has kind of spurred my whole career as a crime writer, because the initial story, the initial crime novel I wrote was based on a story I was told while I was working as a creative writing teacher at Casuarina Prison. It's a very notorious Western Australian, probably the most notorious unsolved murder in Western Australia, I think. It was the murder in 1975 of a local brothel madam by local detectives. And in doing the interviews for what I thought was going to be a non-fiction book, I soon realised that there are a lot of really brave local journalists had tried to write about that story, and some had been kind of warned off, and some had, suffered under the burden of proof, because crime, of course, is by its nature secretive. And so eventually I decided I wasn't going to write it as a non-fiction book, line of sight. I was going to write it as a novel. I kept talking to people, and really what I was trying to get at was what actually happened. And that particular crime, as with a lot of major crimes, there's been a lot of mythology around it, a lot of legend making, and trying to ascertain the reality of the situation, what really kind of happened. I suppose it became a little bit addictive for me, and I became fascinated by it. And for about, 5 years, I just ran around Perth speaking to 50 or 60 different people from all walks of life. And a lot of these people were great characters and fascinating to speak to. But when that book came out, Line of Sight, the first Frank Swann crime novel, I realised there were so many stories left over. People I'd spoken to, like former prostitutes and bookmakers and former coppers, and I realised that a city that I thought I knew quite well, in fact, like you say, there's so much going on underneath the surface. And because crime is by its nature secretive, often those stories I kept to the people involved. Often they never kind of leak out. They leak into the media every now and then when something major happens. Because crime was so well controlled, organised crime, I should say, was so well controlled in Western Australia by the police force, And I don't mean that they controlled it by way of enforcing the law. They controlled it by trying to be pragmatic, I suppose, and allowing certain people to operate and keeping other people out of it. And of course, that led inevitably to corruption, as it always does. But it did create the kind of the conditions that where people are very scared to speak out about those things. So yeah, the true nature of things is often concealed because of the secretive nature of crime, and in West Australia's case, concealed because of the danger of violence, I suppose, around certain stories. And as a writer, that's the kind of place I like to look into.
But also, it's the world of business. I mean, you've got wealthy entrepreneur
Oh yeah.
Paul Enright, who's the, I suppose, not would you call him the antagonist in the story? He's certainly he's the one who instigates all of this. He's called for this investigation into these photographs, but he himself is the beneficiary of a lot of secretive business dealings. And so, I mean, Lee often remarks that he's taken the job because he wants to learn this aspect of the world. It's a lot of learning on the job.
That's right. Well, it's kind of like relates to your last question, because Lee's not from that background, because he was brought up by a kind of a crazy gun club running person in regional Western Australia. The whole idea of Perth's western suburbs and the business culture around it, it's completely new to him. And as I was just describing about myself, he wants to know more about that, because often those people will be, if he stays in this line of work, those people will be either his clients or they'll be his adversaries. And so yeah, he kind of follows up on that. And yeah, I mean, I think all of my crime novels really, this one perhaps the least of any of them, have always looked at that nexus in Western Australia, because it is so traditionally has been so cozy, between politics, organised crime, policing practices, and business practices. And I think of organised crime as a business anyway, because that's essentially what it is. That's why it's organised. So all my novels kind of look at that area. And yeah, Enright is a classic West Australian shonky operator, caught out a little bit during the WA Inc. period. I mean, to my knowledge, we're the only state where 2 consecutive premiers went to jail around about the time this novel is set. So he's a survivor of that period. So he's got a lot of rat cunning, and he's pretty ruthless. He thinks of himself as a good guy and a victim in all this. But yeah, he's based a little bit on one of my students when I was teaching at Casuarina Prison was Alan Bond, the great Australian tycoon and America's Cup hero from the period. And I can't say I got to know him quite well, but he was in my class for about a year, I guess. And I used to watch him quite a lot. He was quite a secretive character. He didn't give a lot away, but he did let slip some, interesting stories about, nothing too revealing about how he went about his business. But he was an interesting person to study, an interesting person to listen to on occasions. And so, well, the story is reasonably well known. But he was in my class at Casuarina, which was a maximum security prison, for those who don't know, in Western Australia, because he had been in minimum security. His crimes were not violent crimes, but he had convinced some prison guards to let him out, presumably for conjugal visits with his wife. Completely illegal at the time. And I don't know how long it was going on for, but Alan Bond being Alan Bond, and similar to my character Enright, he kind of thinks he's above the law. And he was photographed having lunch, I think, on the front porch of a busy cafe in Swanbourne.
Jeez.
And that was hugely embarrassing for the prison guards concerned, but also the Department of whatever the ministry is, and for the government. So he got sent straight to maximum security, which is where I got to know him a little bit. And yeah, Enright's kind of based a little bit on him, guy with rat cunning, pretty tough, nuggety little guy. Went a long way in kind of business because of these instincts for seeing weakness in other people and acting on it, I guess.
And Christina's got a great question in the chat. She says one of the reviews talked about how you incorporate Perth as another character, and also Fremantle. I found that very enjoyable in the story. How do you go about incorporating so much of Perth's different settings into the story? And I'd say into all of your crime writing as well.
Yeah, and a lot of the kind of non-fiction as well. I mean, on one level, it's a pragmatic thing to do because um, I don't know where my readers are going to be, and if a lot of people have never been to Perth, and so there haven't been a lot of films made here, and there haven't been a lot of novels set here, to be honest. And so people don't have a kind of a stock of images in the way that they might with mental images from films and photographs and whatnot, like you would from a storied city like London or New York. So the idea of foregrounding a place like Perth by way of vivid description, I guess, as often as possible in a way that hopefully, seamlessly slots into with the rest of it is pragmatic. But it's also because those are often the parts of the story that I love doing most, because it is a city I love a lot, and it's a city whose stories I like a lot, and particularly the passages set around Fremantle. I actually really like uh, writing those descriptive passages because it allows me to be a little bit lyrical, just a little bit. It's a classic crime novel. A lot of the dialogue is quite pared back and deals with some pretty dark material. So foregrounding what I love about this place is it's kind of a joy to me as well. It's a bit like using humour in the dialogue as a way to leaven some of that darker material. But yeah, it's something I try and do in all my stories for both of those reasons, I guess.
Yeah, I particularly like the plain ordinary sort of like you use in Canning Highway, and you use the Highway to Hell, but also the bush blocks. And then I really loved the scenes wherever Lee Southern met up with Bamba, and they'd go to the is it the
And
north
South
or the
Mole,
south,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the giant container ship would just be coming past them as they're talking. I mean, that's epic stuff. But you don't have to do much with that, do you? You just have to do it. You just have to put it
No,
in.
it's pretty. I mean, I see it from my little writing room in Fremantle, and it literally is like a stage set wall moving. It's like it's an extra kind of a northern wall to the city. As the ship goes past, you can't see anything behind it, above it, or below it. It's like this huge kind of screen moving past. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I see quite commonly, and happy to incorporate.
The setting as well, the time period. So it's sort of early to mid 90s. So the internet's coming in. Frank Swann's now got a big old mobile phone, but also Lee is studying a little bit, and he meets up with a computer hacker. So there's that sort of technological aspect. It's sort of the new tricks for the old dogs, and they're using it in there. Was that an interesting space to explore? Because
Yeah,
using crime doesn't matter what the tech is, they'll always get around it. So there's no sort of benefit to setting it in any particular period, right? But you can play.
that's right. And it is a kind of a turning point period for someone in their line of work because, Frank Swann, the old dog, like you say, he's a very old school. He's a former copper. Um, he he has worked in the detective squad as well as being a beat copper. And his way of running an investigation is by way of informants, which is the traditional way of knowing lots and lots of people. Lots of people owe him favors, and he gets to the bottom of things by way of other people usually, which for a crime writer is great because um, what happened to policing a little bit after this period is it tended to rely more and more on surveillance and less
Mm.
on conversation and consorting squads and informants. It's actually come the other way around now because of apps like Telegram and Signal, um, apps that can't be kind of de-encrypted easily. And
Yeah.
so police, as I understand, have gone back to the really old school kind of policing or detective work that Frank Swann did because there's no other way around it now. You can't surveil people's conversations in real time unless you can break into the app. But Lee is the young dog in the relationship, and it is a bit of a technological turning point. And he doesn't know much about these kind of new inventions. He's used to surveillance of a minor kind, bugs and hidden cameras, and how to operate all of that. But the whole idea that you be able to use the internet now to surveil people and to implant software into computer systems, it's completely new to him. And because he's an autodidact, yeah, he's sitting in on university classes and he gets to meet a hacker. It's a pretty common guide, like a guide type character in a crime novel who knows a lot more about it than he does and who teaches him a little bit about it, I suppose.
And David, back to the image of your mate with sleeping with the hammer next to him. I've got two young girls myself, so I can kind of relate. Don't have the hammer, but
Yeah.
but the central premise is a pretty dark crime that was committed against a young girl, and then Lee is hired to follow up on the re-emergence of some aspects of that. Can you run us through just the basics of it? We don't want to spoil anything in case someone hasn't read it, but this is, it's pretty dark territory to be pulled into with
Yeah,
Lee.
and it was for me as well.
Yeah.
And it was different. It's different from all my other stories because while all, I mean, this is very common in crime fiction, of course, while all my crime novels generally look at I mean, they're not procedurals, is what I'm saying. They're it's kind of crime noir, hard boiled. There's not a kind of a formal investigation, and the central characters are often kind of criminals themselves. But Lee's tasked by Enright to retrieve some photographs, and yeah, while my other crime stories have involved, trying to dig up aspects of a deeper kind of more political or organized crime story. This is probably the most personal. This is the kind of crime that takes place within a family, which is something I've never really looked at before. It's always been a crime out there to do with neo-Nazis or political crime or police corruption or something like that. So this is a particularly odious crime that takes place within a family, and Lee suspects what has gone on. But as he retrieves the photographs and meets the people who have been um, custodians of these photographs, he begins to learn a little bit more about what's going on. So it's hugely complicated because he's trying to remain impassive in a context where, basically as a decent human being, he's appalled and angered and wants to lash out as well. But as are some of the other characters around him. But that's kind of the direction the story goes. It's more of a personal family story than anything I've written before.
I had the feeling of a lot of the time of it was like a slow submerging. You didn't like I think like an inferior version of like someone would just write it like they would just show you all the stuff right up front and plunge you straight in, but you took us there slowly, like layer by layer. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Well, thanks. And again, that it's because it's pretty dark material and it's because it's pretty personal, because it's something that happens in a family. Um, I don't want to directly represent any of that stuff. And so it works by way of suggestion, I guess. You kind of figure out what's going on. You can imagine it, but you don't necessarily want to show it directly. I mean, I've met people from that world before teaching in prison, and yeah, I'm not really interested in them as personalities or deviant psychologies. So yeah, it's more about Lee and how he negotiates all that stuff.
And I was speaking last year to a couple of crime writers for Libby Book Club for WA, including David Warner, and we were talking about how it's often been remarked that in Australian literature and generally in literature, crime is taking that's immediate social commentary role. That sort of, that I suppose began with Dickens. He was writing about contemporary events and seeding them in. So crime is taking that real leading role. Do you have that going through your mind as in your process? Because you
Yeah,
also
yeah,
write
no. I think
forms
I
of
think Dave's absolutely right, and in a sense, I see myself as being part of a longer Australian crime tradition. It's not as well known as it should be, but um, a lot of crime written in Australia in the 19th century was really ahead of its time. I mean, I think of stories like For the Term of His Natural Life. The first novel ever written in Western Australia was by J.B. O'Reilly, Moondyne. Um, Mary Fortune's stories in Victoria and in the goldfields, and many others. They were really ahead of their time in the sense that they often put criminal characters as protagonists, and it um, explored the world from the perspective of someone inside that world. Whereas in America and in England, it was usually the good detective exploring from outside. It was more a game of wits and puzzles and less social comment. Whereas in Australia, I think it started really early and really on until the 1920s and 1930s in America with the birth of the hard-boiled or noir crime writing genre that the rest of the world caught up, if you like.
Mm.
So I absolutely agree with Dave, and I see myself as part of that longer tradition. I think there are good reasons for it. I mean, crime fiction is a great means of looking at people. I mean, I think basically people learn a lot about themselves when they find themselves in extreme situations. And crime fiction, I think, is the genre par excellence for looking at people in extreme situations. And also that that nexus I described before between politics, organised crime, and business, um, in a way that, so it can be quite political. Crime novels can be quite political novels, but in a way that's not didactic, in a way that um, doesn't preach, in a way that hopefully just brings a reader along, um, even if it's just for the purposes of entertainment. So, yeah, I think Dave is absolutely right, as he is with most things.
Thanks, David. Well, we have a great question from Madeline Dickey, and then also some commentary to go with it, which is great. So, Madeline says, "I love the use of the crime novel as social commentary, and I like your focus on politics, crime, rather than deviant psychologies. Can you talk a little to the ethics of writing violence? Is there a line in the sand that you won't cross, or will? I found the sexual violence against Liam when he was a little boy unbelievably unsettling. Were you ever umming or ahhing about the inclusion of this?" Bill Burdislick says, "I think he handled the demarcation well. The crimes against the child were intimated. There was nothing salacious." What's that line like to create toward?
Yeah. Um, thanks for the question, Madeline, and the comment, Bill. Yeah, I did and ah about that. Um, and I'm very aware that there is a line. Um, like I said, I'm careful about not representing any of that stuff directly. I mean, traditionally, vis-a-vis the ethics of writing violence, I feel like I've got my own inbuilt. I mean, I'm aware of the broader philosophical and ethical kind of guidelines and discussions, but you know, and I've talked a bit about this in the past. I'm someone who's seen a lot of violence directly, um, a lot of really ugly violence, a lot of murder, a lot of mayhem when I was quite young, and I know what it feels like. It's real violence is extremely ugly and unsettling. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I mean, Hollywood does its best to make it, you know, seem less ugly than it actually is, to the point that it's often kind of cartoonish. So for me, when I start feeling trauma, when I start feeling my nerves buzzing, then I know I'm going near that kind of danger zone. I mean, I've rarely seen in books or in film anything as ugly, or that even remotely approaches real violence, and that's a good thing, I think. So for me personally, I think about the ethics of it quite closely, but I also try and trust my feelings too, and my feelings are based on real experience rather than um, reading other writers, I suppose.
And David, as expressed or explored in the stories, you know, Frank Swann and Lee Southern, are they're your lines in a lot of ways. Frank is cynical, but he's not without a heart, and Lee is learning the trade, but he's also someone with very strong morals. He's he's got a sort of clear idea.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make, because often in the kind of crime that I like, crime fiction and kind of noir, hard-boiled genre, the line between the protagonist and antagonist, um, the investigator and the criminal is often it's often very minor.
Mm.
But what line there is often based on the fact that um, there's an aspect of shame, I suppose, is a simple way to describe it. When someone like Frank Swann or Lee Southern knows they're approaching, crossing the line, they know that there's a line there. And if they do cross it, it's always in defense of someone else rather than for personal gain or for opportunistic reasons or just for the sheer pleasure of inflicting pain on other people. It's always in defense of other people, and they always feel bad about it afterwards. And I think that's where the kind of the line is drawn. They're essentially good people, and I think um, if there's a clear kind of binary between predator and protector, they're definitely more the kind of the protector psychology.
I can see like a line of logic going through some of your previous work as well, like, you know, exploration of the unspoken, the unexplored, looking at different topics and different situations with that literary eye rather than the obvious eye. So the previous book we spoke about was The Sawdust House. You and I spoke at the Margaret River Readers and Writers Festival, which is set, you know, in the United States in the 18th century, following a boxer who, to the public, was this, you know, rough and tumble, violent man who felt no fear, yet he was completely human. And we see through your eyes, through your writing, that, you know, we see the full measure of this man. Is that's sort of not an affectation, but a theme that you like to explore, that there is this public face or this public misunderstanding, but actually, if you just take the time and look at it with fresh eyes and with an open heart, you can actually see there's so much more to the story and there's so much more reality to it.
Yeah, well, like a lot of writers, I mean, and readers, of course, what motivates me a lot is trying to understand the great mystery of human behaviour, why we are like we are. And yeah, so Sullivan is a good example of that. He's someone with a public-facing persona, which is, you know, flamboyant and you know, arrogant, I suppose, in some ways. And yet, having done the research that I did and found some documents that he had spoken in, I could see that, yeah, the trauma that was visited on his body, like many Australian convicts, was absolutely horrific. And so, yeah, I wanted to explore those deeper parts of his personality that he was hidden. And again, going back to something I said a little bit earlier, even though that's a historical fiction novel, not a crime novel, I am interested in human behaviour in extremis. I am interested in the way that we learn things about ourselves when we find ourselves in extreme situations. And he's a guy who's essentially on death row, and he's got to come to terms with himself. And in a way, I guess that's also something that characters like Frank Swann and Lee Southern have to do at certain points as well, particularly where they realise that, yeah, they're in too deep. They've overstepped the mark, or they're putting themselves in danger, I guess.
David, Sawdust House was the previous book to I'm Already Dead. What was it like to switch writing styles and writing genres and expect, you know, Sawdust House has quite an experimental literary take. It's if people have read it, but you know, on one page it's the narrator, and then on the other page it's Sullivan. So it's this sort of title fight almost between the two, and then you're switching to crime in your way. What was that like to go from one to the next?
Yeah, no, it was great. I mean, I really, really loved writing the Sawdust House because it just allowed me to be a little bit more lyrical, like you say, experimental. I mean, when I finished the draft, I wasn't even really sure what I had, but I enjoyed the process, and I mean, I wrote it not without any kind of expectations, so it was a joyous and kind of liberating experience writing it, and because I'd had a little bit of a holiday, I suppose, in writing the Sawdust House, I came back to writing crime fiction refreshed, I suppose. And I knew that there was more I wanted to learn about Lee Southern and Frank Swann, and that seemed like a good way to go about it, I guess, moving the story a little bit forward. And so, yeah, no, I enjoy both. They're completely different. It's also why I like writing creative nonfiction too. They exercise different parts of your writing muscle, wherever that muscle resides.
Well, just an observation, it's sort of one of my bugbears, but like good writing is good writing, isn't it? It's just like the thing that shits me about genre, to everyone talking about genres, and it's like crime fiction can be underestimated, romance writing can be underestimated, just because people put a label on it. But good writing is good writing, isn't it?
You are very on the money there, because next Monday morning I have to give a lecture to a bunch of first year university students about genre,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm leading with. I mean, before you think of categories and genres and styles and forms of content, um, or a structure or form, yeah, there's good writing and there's bad writing, and I think increasingly, and rightly so, that's the direction that certainly, putting my academic hat on, that's the direction things have been trending within the academy, but also not so much with criticism and literary prizes, but certainly readers have picked up on it. And yeah, good writing is good writing. A good crime novel can be deeply philosophical and fascinating and say a lot about our social lives, um, in the same way that a literary fiction novel can, just structured slightly differently.
Well, Dave, we've got about 19 minutes to go. So come on, if anyone has a question for David about anything, crime writing, I'm already dead, literature, teaching writing to people in prison. Even David, you've been doing also in part of the festival this year, and also in previous years, you've been doing tours around Perth and Fremantle of the background history of the actual places that we've been in. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, not so much around Fremantle, but yeah, a few years ago for the Perth Festival, I was asked to give a walking tour of Northbridge and look at some of its kind of longer, settlement history. And it was once an area with a lot of opium dens, and then it was, during the 1930s and 40s, it became an area of illegal casinos. And during the 70s, when drug manufacturing was an important industry, it became an important place to launder money. There was a lot of mafia involvement. And yeah, it was the tour basically just goes for an hour and a half, going to different locations. Rose Street, or the Rose Street brothels, was a pretty fascinating culture, going back to really early 19th century, sorry, 20th century. Um, and yeah, that's quite good fun to do. And I've got another one in a few weeks, I think, as part of the Borloo Festival, or Perth Festival again. But that's something I haven't thought about doing in Fremantle. I know a little bit more about Northbridge, perhaps, than Perth's Fremantle's criminal history.
Well, maybe just to return to a comment you made right at the start that, Perth and Fremantle, even WA, we're very good at historical amnesia. I mean, today I took my girls up to the Oliver Hill gun battery in the centre of Rottnest Arm, which has, a 9.2-inch naval gun that protected Fremantle during the Second World War. And people were blown away that this existed. They had no idea. Yet it's this incredible piece of history. We were the largest submarine base on the planet in World War II, yet totally secret. No one knows about it. What is it about Perth or Western Australia in particular that we have this inbuilt almost form of amnesia, that we forget our history or even our current history?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's deliberate. I mean, particularly at a place like Wodgumup or Rotto. You talked a little bit about it earlier. I mean, it's also a place I used to go as a kid, completely unknowing about its place as a site of Aboriginal incarceration for a very long period of time, and a lot of deaths in custody, and its war history. I did know about, because we used to go and sneak into the tunnels and muck around in there. But I think in general, some of it's political as far as Perth goes. The desire to kind of erase cultural memories around um, some of the nastier parts of our history and kind of move on. pretty political. I think there's been a preference for more kind of postcard images of what a place like Perth is as a former as a ongoing colony. I think this is something that now Tassie writer Robert Desai described as the failure to break the covenant between lived life and the stories we tell about it. So there's what's really, again, we're going back to this idea of lived life, real stories, and the stuff going on the surface. And also the fact that Perth is a real migrant city. It was a small, impoverished city right up until the 1960s. My grandfather was a brewer at the Swann Brewery, and the Swann Brewery was Western Australia's largest employer until 1961, when I think the first nickel boom happened. And prior to that, it was, as Robert Drew described, the big industries were whaling, chopping down trees, and one other which I've forgotten. So not much kind of news came out of here. It was a small kind of insular place. And then the mining boom started to happen, and the population started to double every, kind of 10 years. And that has also led to its own form of amnesia, because new people are, less interested in the longer history. They don't have any kind of cultural memory of what's gone past. And also, I think, because I've written about, Perth architecture a bit in the past as well, that has led similarly to when these booms happened. They happened at a time when, the brutalist architecture style was in vogue. And so a lot of the beautiful old buildings in Perth were bowled over, replaced by these kind of, well, they have their own kind of beauty, I suppose, but concrete buildings. And that, of course, when you erase those kind of buildings, that erases a lot of memory, which is why I like living in Fremantle, because it still has its original gold rush architecture, but not because of any moral, superiority or anything like that. It's a Fremantle in that respect is a beneficiary of neglect. It was considered to be so poor that it wasn't even worthy of redevelopment. And yeah, we're the beneficiaries of that now, because it still has quite a good atmosphere down there in the West End with the old buildings and whatnot.
No, I'd agree. I mean, I live in up near Joondalup, which is very new and very antiseptic. And I sort of wonder, how can this ever grow its own distinct culture? It's so prescribed. The architecture is so prescribed. So yeah, it's what I appreciate that about Fremantle as well. So that's a nice segue, actually. Bill's back with a comment. He says it's already been said. However, I wanted to add that I thoroughly enjoyed the way you described locations. It was terrific to read about Wattleup, Yangebup, etc. Also, it seemed to me the descriptions were really accurate. I look forward to reading your other works. I mean, we touched on it a little bit, but it's your love of the locality, your love of where you're at shines through. Is it a conscious decision from you to write about where you are and to bring these stories to life and bring it all in together? Because it never feels parochial. It just feels natural. It just feels like interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have strong parochial feelings, but I do feel like I want to honour the place that I live in. And I have quite strong feelings for Western Australia because, my family moved a lot when we were kids. I think I went to 8 different primary schools, and we moved 21 times before I was 10. And West Australia, the Pilbara and Perth, that was the place we stopped. So it was the first place I really got to kind of breathe in and soak up a place. And so it's why, of all the places I've lived, it's the place that I consider home. And I guess, there was another non-fiction book I wrote called Perth, which really opened my eyes again, because it required a great amount of research, and taught me a lot about some of the more kind of suburban histories of place, as opposed to the larger kind of narratives of conquest and all of that. So I really appreciate the quiet corners of this place, as well as the places I maybe know better, and think about why they've become that way. But yeah, I suppose it's a form of honouring the place, I guess.
Thanks, David. Well, I've got to say, you've had quite an impact throughout your career, but I'm already Dead's doing really well. You've had 1,000 loans through the Libby app for the ebook, and also I think 300 odd downloads for the audio book. So it's definitely connecting with readers, who are devotees or first timers with you. So just to ask about the audiobook, this is the second outing that you've had with this particular narrator, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. He's a young actor in London trying to make a go of it. And so when the first audiobook of True West came out, I think as is common, I was given a choice of a few people who had auditioned for it, and I liked his I liked his measured tone. I haven't actually listened to the audiobook of I'm Already Dead yet. I should do that. I'm saving it up for a country drive. But like I
Yeah.
said before, I can't convince my family to listen to the audiobook of True West yet either. So um, we listen to music and sing in the car instead. But one day I'll get my way and get to listen to the full thing. But yeah, I liked his measured, understated way. I mean, it must be a hard thing to do to narrate a book, I imagine, for an actor. And because I noticed some of the other people who'd auditioned, they were good, but they were maybe over ockering it a little bit, over egging it a bit. And he seemed to me that he had just this nice kind of measured way of going about it. So I was very happy with that. I was very happy when Adam signed on for the second one as well. You'll be
Yeah.
able to find Adam on Instagram, but yeah, I wish him well in his acting career in London.
No worries. Jordan is saying, I enjoy the audio of For I'm Already Dead. Julianne's chopped in. Yeah, Adam Fitzgerald. Highly recommend I'm Already Dead audiobook. So I'll have to get it myself. Well, I read this in 2 days. So like I said, I'm over on writing this for a family holiday. So I saved this as my beach read, and it became my kind of all-encompassing read. Like, up late at night, early in the mornings. Yeah, it was, I described it, I think, as a book without breaks. In writing, I'm Already Dead, David, you have your own writing space in Fremantle, where you can just go all out, can't you? Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about that space and how that influences you?
yeah. I mean, I love my space. I'm lucky enough to have a little writing room at Old Customs House, and it's run by a non-profit arts organisation called Artsource, who are fantastic. And I've had the room for a while, and on occasions I get like full days to work, and I just treat it like a job. I go in there and in the morning, and I do a morning shift, and then I have a little break. And because I'm usually exhausted by then, I have a siesta, ideally about 40 minutes. I've got a little swag on the ground, which is great. It's not so comfortable that I sleep all afternoon, um, but I get have a little 40-minute siesta, and then I do an afternoon shift. And I'm often asked about the pacing of the crime novels, and the the true answer is it's because I rarely get those full days to write, and so often if I know I've got 40 minutes or an hour before I have to go to work because I work full time, um, I will go in there and I'm just determined to finish a chapter before I go. I don't like to leave chapters undone before the next day. Though there are advantages to taking that approach too. One of my early creative writing mentors said it's always good to finish halfway through a sentence, so you know you've got something to do. You don't feel that anxiety the next day with like, what the hell's am I gonna say now? But I like to finish a chapter, and often I don't get a great deal of time, so the chapters are often quite short, and that I think is
Propulsive.
reflected in the pace. Yeah, and I like to switch between characters, not so much in this novel or even in True West, but in my other crime novels. It seems to me that one other interesting aspect of crime is that you're trying to get a picture of something that is contested, a contested truth. So having different characters' perspectives on something that may or may not have happened is an interesting way to circle around uh, that contested truth. And it's a challenge for me as a writer too, because I often don't know where those stories are going to kind of conjoin. But yeah, that's basically my writing practice. A bit mad, and but I do like those full days.
Oh, nice. Well, David, we're into almost the final 5 minutes. So I told Madeline Dickey I'd get to her question last. So what kind of trouble will Lee find himself in next? Just to circle back around to I'm Already Dead. Lee Southern, what's potentially what's next for him? Because he's only young in this, isn't he? In true
Yeah,
Westie, 17,
he's
18.
he's still only in his early 20s. But see, I made the mistake with Frank Swann, right? I started him off in his
Yeah, he's
mid
pretty old.
30s,
Yeah.
and so by the time I brought it up to the present 2024, I don't know, he'd be 180 years old or something like that. So I'm trying to start Lee young, so I've got more miles in his legs to go. I am thinking about another Lee Southern story. I've got another crime novel coming out in September, I believe it is.
So,
But this one is quite different. This is my first ever contemporary story, um, and it's set on a fishing boat in the Pacific Ocean. It's 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 environmental crime, I suppose, that I'm really looking at, and crimes associated with maritime slavery and industrial fishing. And that's a completely new character. And he's also coming back in another crime novel next year, I think October next year. And that's taking place largely in Fremantle ports. This is about the kind of the cocaine gold rush, which Australia's going through at the moment. Um, and again, the use of maritime crime, I suppose, is the theme I'm working with. But I'm in between books at the moment. I've just finished, just basically handed that one in. And so I'm thinking about another Lee Southern novel um, while I'm doing other things. And yes, the story's slowly starting to percolate. I've never I've never tried a locked room mystery kind of story, so that might be a bit of a challenge to work with. Maybe set in a prison, something like that, but we'll see.
this is an extremely broad question, but what do you love about writing? Is it essentially everything? I mean, it's uh, the the ability that you have to switch genres, switch stories, but consistently do it and to make it happen and then to put them out. It's very admirable. What do you love about this process that brings it all together?
I do. I really do love it. I think for me, it's an escape. Um, it, it's an escape into writing, but it's also a way for me to work things out. Um, and really, that's what attracted me to writing in the first place. I had all this stuff going on in my head because of these experiences I'd had. And, I hit the books and I studied philosophy and all manner of other things. And it was really only in writing fiction that I was able to achieve any kind of understanding about the things I was trying to figure out. So it's both of those things. It's a way for me to learn things about myself and others. It's an escape from the chaos of, trying to earn a living and family life. Um, but it's also a beautiful kind of exhaustion, I think. Um, it's not unproblematic. I mean, it creates kind of anxiety, I think, writing, because I never really know, because I'm not a planner, I never really know where a story is going to go. So that anxiety waxes and wanes between something that is enervating and something that is slightly paralyzing. Um, but I just love it. I mean, I think first I'm a reader, and I love books and I love book culture and I love reading, and writing for me is my way of being part of it, I guess.
Thank you, David. Well, final question. Do you have a book recommendation for our listeners tonight? Anything
Oh,
on your pile or that you've recently finished that really grabbed you?
yeah, I'd like to recommend. I mean, I'm reading a fantastic non-fiction book at the moment called The Anarchy by Dalrymple about the East India Company in India. Um, Something that some of my ancestors played a part in. I'm just starting to find out. But a good Australian crime novel I would recommend. Yeah, um, Dave Warner's latest is a ripper.
Summer of
Um,
Blood? Yeah.
Summer of Blood, Karen Herbert's Vertigo, but a really good young Australian crime writer I really rate is Ian Ryan. He's a Melbourne-based crime writer, and his novel The Strip. It's
Okay.
about as kind of hard-boiled or noirish as an Australian novel can get, um, and it's about police corruption and culture in the Gold Coast. I think it's the 1980s. It's been a while since I read it, but it's it's very dark and seedy, but great writing. He's got a really great ear for dialogue, and I'll lend you a copy, David, if you want.
Sounds good. No, it's pretty good.
But yeah, that was a great one.
Yeah, no, I read Vertigo a couple of months ago, and I really enjoyed that too. Karen's great. So,
Yeah.
well, David, that's all we have time for. But thank you very much for coming on Libby Book Club for WA. David's book is I Am Already Dead. If you've read it again. If you haven't, please read it. Recommend it to somebody else. It's available now on the Libby app and also as an audio book. So fantastic to have you here. Thank you to Overdrive Australia and to the State Library of WA for hosting us. And thank you very much for everyone for tuning in. It's really good to see you all here. And thank you for all your questions. And David, thank you again for writing this book. And thanks for being such a great
And
person.
thank you, David, and thank you also for everyone for tuning in. Everybody's busy, I know, and setting aside an hour of your life, two book guys having a chat is, I think it's great.
That's a good thing. Thank you very much. Well, good night, everybody, and have a great rest of your week. I'll see you later.